Welcome to the Wild Side. That was Nico Case with The Tigers Have Spoken, and I am your host, Kight. And today we are going to be talking about tigers, as you might have guessed. And the reason for this is that I recently read a book that I was sent to review for a magazine article, and it was a book about tigers that was primarily photographic in nature and not text-heavy. And the photographs were all taken by a photographer who works primarily for National Geographic. And over the last 10 years or so, he has been involved in lots of shoots of large cats. And tigers have particularly fascinated him because they are huge and they're endangered, so you don't get to see them a whole lot, but when you do, they're incredibly impressive. And the book is really interesting because the images are very powerful. He shows them, these animals kind of in, a natural setting, doing things we don't always get to see. But he also shows their interactions with scientists, the people who are on the ground trying to save them, and he shows the habitats that they live in and kind of the things that people do in those habitats as well. So you really get a sense of the whole story behind what's going on in tigers' lives. And it is quite an interesting thing, and it's quite moving in many ways because these animals are in quite a lot of trouble. And so it inspired me to go and do a little bit more research because, as I said, there's not a whole lot of text in this book, so there were some things I wanted to find out about tigers. And that is what I want to talk to you about today. So all of this research that I found out about kind of the natural history of these animals intertwined with the more conservation-y types of stuff that I was reading about in that book. And in case you are curious to follow up and see the book for yourself, because it does have some really great images, I'll put information about it on the Wildside webpage so you can find your own copy. So first I want to start off by thinking about what is a tiger. And I know that seems a bit silly, but I do always like to kind of place these organisms that I talk about in kind of an evolutionary context. And there are both extant species, so species that still exist, and others that have more recently gone extinct. And all of these have descended from an ancient species called Panthera paleosinensis. And if you know your Latin, then you know that this is an ancient animal that was found in Asia somewhere. And specifically it was found in China and in Java. And it was a smaller tiger than the ones that we have today, and it lived about 2 million years ago. And there are other more modern-like tigers that have also been found in this region, first in Java and then kind of China and Sumatra. And these were a little bit closer to our time, so about 1.8 to 1.6 million years ago, which of course is still quite a long time away. And since then we've had the evolution of 9 different species of tiger, or subspecies I should say also, that we're familiar with today. And the scientific name for these guys is Panthera tigris, and it's a group, as I said, that includes 9 different subspecies. So they originally would have been one single species, but then because they've had some geographical isolation and probably also some isolation resulting from behavioral differences, they haven't bred, and so they've been able to kind of branch off and become their own little subspecies that don't generally tend to hybridize, although there are some natural hybridizations that people do see from time to time. So the fact that we have the 9 different subspecies, and the fact that each of these subspecies can actually look and behave quite differently from the others, is quite impressive in the world of cats. This is the most variation we find in any kind of cat species that we know of today. These guys can grow, as I kind of indicated earlier, quite massive, so the largest can have a total body length of 11 feet, and that is basically going from the nose all the way to the tip of the tail. The tail obviously helps make that figure particularly impressive, but because it probably does add a couple of feet onto the body, but still that's quite a long animal. Their weight can exceed 306 kilograms. Females do generally tend to be smaller than males and also have slightly smaller paws, but these are still quite large animals, even on the smaller side of things. Now, you all know what tigers look like, so they have kind of reddish-orange fur that has stripes. But some of them are much more red, and others are more kind of tan-like. There are also some variations, so you've probably been to a zoo at some point and maybe seen a white tiger. And this is a natural variation, we just don't see it very often in the wild. There's another one called strawberry, and that's another rare one that does pop up from time to time. And that one is quite unusual because actually on the legs, they can be quite white and then have almost no stripes. And then elsewhere it's kind of that strawberry blondish sort of color. Now the stripe pattern is not only found on the animal's fur, but also on the skin. So if you were to shave all of its fur off, you'd still be able to see that pattern. And it's completely unique to each tiger. So these things can be used to identify individuals, and scientists often take photographs of all the animals in their region and then use those to create a database so that they can track certain individuals from time to time. And the stripes are important because they help individuals blend into the environment because they mimic shadows. And there are some great images in this book of some tigers that are standing in kind of a bed of reeds, and the reeds against their skin, it's amazing that you can't really tell the difference between a reed and a stripe. It really does help the animals blend right in. You wouldn't even know that they were there if you walked right next to them, which is actually kind of scary, and you really get a sense of why these animals can be so effective as predators when you see that kind of image. Now they tend to have particularly large heads and also very powerful front legs and arms, and in fact during the photographic session that kind of made up all the different chapters of these books, each one was in a different country. So there was one that this guy performed in India, and while he was there taking all these photographs, he unfortunately was around whenever a tiger went into a field that had a poor guy that happened to be crossing it in the middle of the night. And the tiger ran into this guy, and with one swipe of its paw, and that was it, it hit the guy across the head and he died instantly. So that gives you an idea of just how incredibly strong these animals are, even as in that case, when they aren't directly out there to hurt you on purpose. In this case, the tiger was just kind of trying to bat this guy away and then run off. It wasn't even really having any sort of a full-on aggressive encounter. So that really gives you a sense of the kind of amazing strength that these individuals can have. The canines are also quite a powerful thing, so it's not just their paws, it's also their teeth. They're the largest found in any living cat, so they are quite massive. And thanks to the fact that they are quite big and strong and very good predators, these guys can live for quite a long time, both in the wild and in captivity. And it seems to be about 20 to 25 years. That's the norm for these animals, assuming they aren't in regions that are heavily poached, because of course that is one of the issues facing these animals. And tigers that live in highly poached areas obviously are going to live much briefer lives. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 9 subspecies, or I should say there were 9 subspecies of tiger. The first is the Bengal tiger, or also known as the Indian tiger. And this guy lives in India, Nepal, Bhutan, and Bangladesh. And it's the most common of all the subspecies. It's found in a variety of habitats, from grasslands to rainforests to mangroves, and it kind of is seemingly the healthiest population at the moment, so there might be as many as about 1,800 of these guys. Another subspecies is the Indo-Chinese tiger, also known as Corbett's tiger, and it's found in Cambodia, China, Laos, Burma, Thailand, and Vietnam. And these guys prefer to live in hillier, more mountainous areas, which is actually to their advantage because those are the places where there aren't as many people and there isn't as much kind of human-caused habitat destruction. The Malayan tiger lives pretty much exactly where you think, given its name, so it's found only in the southern part of the Malay Peninsula. And one of the amazing things about this is that it was only recognized as a distinct subspecies in 2004, which just goes to show you that even though these things have been studied for quite a long time, there's still a whole lot that we don't know about them. The Sumatran tiger, again, also lives probably exactly where you think, so it's found only on the Indonesian island of Sumatra, and it's the smallest of all the living species, and that's probably because it does live on this very small island, and things do tend to kind of scale to their habitat. So when you've got really big, wide open spaces, animals can grow huge because they have lots of resources and they can roam around. But when you have really small, confined environments, you often have animals being much smaller. So that's why the Sumatran tiger is quite small. It's also small because it's adapted for life in really thick rainforests, and it's not going to be very easy to go trampling about quietly and preying on animals if you're a gigantic organism. This is also the most genetically distinct of all the species. So maybe it was one of the ones that branched off earlier, maybe it is one that has just been alone longer for whatever reason, but it definitely does have more of its own distinct genome than these other guys. The Siberian tiger is another you probably have heard of. It's also known as the Amur tiger, and these guys live in far eastern Siberia in some pretty harsh habitats. And probably partly related to that, they are the largest of all the living tiger subspecies, and one of the largest felids to have ever lived. And the reason that I suggest that their size is related to the cold is that you do often find that animals in quite cold habitats will be a bit bigger so that they can have a bit more fat to kind of keep them insulated. They can have a bit more ratio of kind of the volume that's exposed to the outside and the amount that's inside, capable of kind of pumping around nice warm blood and holding muscle to keep them warm. And so they have probably gotten a bit larger so that they can stay warmer in that really harsh habitat. Now the South China tiger is the last of the living subspecies. This is also known as the Amoy or the Xiamen tiger. And amazingly, this went unseen for over 20 years and probably in all likelihood is extinct in the wild, but there are still several that exist in captivity. And some people are interested in breeding these up and reintroducing them, which would be fantastic if it worked, if they do have enough habitat out there to work for them. But it may be that effectively these guys are no longer going to be found in the wild. They are from now on only going to be a species that we see in zoos. Now there are 3 remaining subspecies, the Bali, the Caspian, and the Javan tiger, and all of these have gone extinct. The Bali was originally the smallest subspecies, but then it was it went extinct because it was hunted out of its habitat by people. The Caspian tiger lived in forested areas near the Caspian Sea and on into Central Asia, but then it went extinct in the 1970s. And the last of these to vanish was the Javan tiger, which was last seen in 1979. So I guess if you were really optimistic, you might say, actually, there could be some of these out there and we just haven't seen them, but most likely these aren't present anymore in the wild, and they no longer exist. Welcome back to the Wild Side. That was Vanessa May with Emerald Tiger. And just before the break, I was talking about the 3 subspecies of tiger that have gone extinct, and that is kind of a nice entrance into the next topic, which is the conservation status of tigers. And I kind of wanted to go into this earlier because sometimes I end the show talking about conservation stuff, and that can be a bit of a downer because often that's a depressing story. And what I think is actually a better idea here is to think about that and then think about the life history traits of these animals and think about how we can use that knowledge actually to our favor and to the favor of these animals and to kind of help them out. So I'll be a bit more positive this week as I talk about tigers. So the bad news is that regardless of subspecies, tigers are endangered, and that is something that was decided in 1986, and there are some varieties that are in more trouble than others. So the Bengal tiger, for example, is classified as endangered, and it is the most common, as I mentioned earlier, but there are still fewer than 2,500 remaining in the wild. I think I may have said 1,800 earlier, and actually that figure is for India, I believe. India has the largest population of tigers in the world, and which is really exciting, actually. They've done an amazing job trying to keep these animals safe. And across the entire range of this tiger, there are about 2,500. The Indo-Chinese subspecies is also endangered, and there are significantly fewer of these, only about 600 to 650. The Malayan tiger, also endangered, has about 500 tigers currently living in Malaysia. The Sumatran is the worst off, critically endangered, with maybe 400 to 500 in the wild. The Siberian tiger is also endangered and has only 350 to 400 adults in the wild. And what's really interesting, though, is that actually these guys, as of the 1940s, there were only about 20 to 30 of them left, period, in all of nature. And from that really low number, they were able to breed themselves up to, 20 times that many almost that we see now. And they were doing that without any help from humans. And that just really goes to show that these animals can be incredibly resilient. They are very good at breeding. They are very good at rebounding. And that, I think, offers quite a lot of hope. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the South China tiger is functionally extinct. So it's registered as critically endangered, but actually, because they're only found in zoos and because there are so few of them and because there are a lot of barriers to reintroducing them, and for all intents and purposes, these guys are basically extinct, even though they are still registered as critically endangered. Now, the biggest problem that faces these animals is the loss of their habitat. And over just the last 100 years, their range has shrunk by about 93%. And from just 1997 to 2007 alone, so for basically the last 10 or so years, there has been about a 41% decrease in the area occupied by tigers in the wild. So this is a really horrendous problem for them. It's affecting them very negatively. And this is because nearly everywhere tigers live, humans are either removing their habitat or altering their habitat, so it's no longer as useful to them. Maybe they can't find where they need to go hunting, they can't find places to breed, whatever the case might be, the habitat is just no longer suitable for these big animals. And the stuff that we're doing there is primarily agriculture, so it's people going in and raising the trees and planting crops. But sometimes also they're going in to do other things that are actually even more destructive, things like mining and logging and building homes. And so at least when you've got crops out there, you do kind of have some wildlife. You might have some prey that can still survive in that habitat that the tigers could hunt. But with some of these other things, it completely gets rid of all of the vegetation. It makes the whole environment unnatural, and it's no longer suitable for really anything at all. And of course that's a problem not just for tigers, but for basically the whole ecosystem. Now in some cases, alteration can even mean consumption of tiger prey by the humans themselves. And so you might have a habitat that looks like it's perfectly good, and it should sustain lots of tigers, but people are going into that habitat and eating the same things that the tigers need to eat themselves. Now individual tigers need about 40 kills per year, so they can go, a week and a half or so between their feeds. They don't have to have an animal every day. But mothers that are feeding cubs can need somewhere around 70, so almost twice what an individual animal would need. And this means that there is quite a pressure on the habitat to supply them the deer and the pigs and the other sorts of animals that they need. And if humans go in and are hunting those things out for their own consumption, obviously the tiger is going to suffer. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but another major problem for tigers is poaching. And this, of course, is banned internationally by CITES, but there is still a really thriving trade on the black market. Now, historically, you probably already know this, tigers were hunted quite a lot. So originally it was kind of a thing of stature. People would want to show that they were very manly and powerful and they were good hunters, so they would go out and get the ultimate quarry, which was these massive tigers. And back in the day, this would have been done by hand effectively. You would only have had a knife or a sword or maybe a spear that you could have thrown. But very early on, this was a significant endeavor, and so to show that you could do that on your own was indeed quite a feat. And then over time, this kind of shifted, and colonists actually, so people from Europe that went and settled in India and kind of Southeast Asia in general, they actually viewed tigers as pests because, of course, they were quite dangerous. There were a lot of them. There were lots of attacks because people were just kind of showing up for the first time, and it was the first time that there were the numbers of people that were there and the type of encroachment was really changing. So it was really the first time in certain ways that humans and tigers were coming into these sorts of interactions with each other. The scale on which we were doing things was totally different at this time. And so colonists would just go in and shoot hundreds of them or even thousands of them at a go. I mean, it was an amazing number. And you can see this historical images of just hundreds of tiger bodies laid out in a grassland. It's phenomenal in a really depressing sort of way. Also after that, this kind of transitioned into a period when furs were quite desirable for fashion and for decorating. And so there was quite a market for these things and quite an interest in going out and killing them. But now, all of these things are more or less a thing of the past, although they do kind of linger a little bit. But the biggest problem for tigers is the fact that their parts are a huge commodity for use in traditional medicine. And some researchers have called them the universal apothecary. And that's because people who do traditional medicine use pretty much everything from the tail of the animals all the way up to the whiskers and the nose. And oddly enough, even their poo can be consumed for medicinal purposes. So there is really nothing that goes to waste in terms of these animals. And in case you're kind of curious, the specifics behind this are that tigers are thought to heal liver and kidney function. They're used to treat a variety of things like epilepsy, baldness, inflammation, nightmares, headaches, toothaches, malaria, you name it. Their bones have been used to create a broth in which people will bathe newborn babies because they think that this will keep the babies strong and healthy and keep sickness away. Their bones can be used to make wine, and this is actually kind of gross. They soak the carcass in rice wine that has already been prepared, and it absorbs bits from the carcass itself. It must taste absolutely vile. But this is thought to cure arthritis and muscle pain, to stimulate blood flow and qi, and to impart strength and virility. So this is one of the ways in which people have consumed tiger kind of as, I won't say an aphrodisiac, but kind of like Viagra basically, to help you do better in bed. And also, sometimes people simply are interested in consuming tiger meat as you would any other sort of meat. So there's basically no part of the tiger that would go to waste once it's killed by a poacher, and there's high demand for all of this stuff. And tiger trafficking is a serious issue. So with most animal products on the black market, you've basically got people moving these things around who are also involved not only in animal things, but in drugs and weapons and slavery and organized crime. So you get these huge syndicates that do all of this kind of nefarious stuff, and it all raises money to help the other things. So it is a serious problem, not just for animal lovers. And these guys are well funded, they're well equipped, they're very well protected. So when rangers go in and are able to stop poachers and confiscate their stuff, they find that they have the newest of weapons, they have night vision goggles, they have all sorts of gear that put them light years ahead of these poor rangers that often have basically guns that should be in museums, and they just aren't nearly as well equipped. And most of the criminals, unfortunately, that are actually captured are people who are quite low ranking. They're poorly paid locals, they're not very thoroughly punished, and it's very hard to conduct extensive stings and capture the real people in charge, who are these kind of mob boss types. And so a lot of times, even when they do capture these kind of lower ranking guys, they basically give them a slap on the wrist and send them on their way, because they know that these are just basically a dime per dozen. You know, I mean, there are tons and tons of these guys. They're so desperate for money that they'll do just about anything. And it's really the mob bosses that they want to stop, because they're the ones thinking of this and supplying everything and really creating the market for this activity. So the huge demand in China in particular, but also elsewhere, means that trafficking is still incredibly profitable, even though there are risks associated. You might get someone caught every now and then, you might lose some of your weapon. And for even the people that are sent out there to do the poaching, they can get killed in the process of this by rangers, by the tigers themselves. All of this is quite dangerous, but it has such a huge monetary reward at the end that people will try it anyway. And just to give you an idea of that, a single bowl of tiger soup might sell for something like $320 in Taiwan. Individual tiger parts can go for about $1,700 a piece, so that's things like a single eyeball, a single tiger penis, which is highly desirable. A whole body, if you were to bring back the entire thing and sell it all at once, might go for about $7,000. And if you'd have the powdered tiger bones and grind them up so that you can, put them in drinks or soups or whatever, that can go for something like $500 a gram. So this is serious money that people can make from this stuff, which you can see would cause these people to be willing to take a big chance. But, as I said earlier, just before I started talking about all this conservation stuff, things do sound kind of dire, but there's a lot of really good ongoing research, and there are lots of really good conservation programs, and people are making headway, and there is some hope. And after the break here, I want to come back and talk about some of the things that we are finding out about tigers, and think about how we can put that information to use. Welcome back to The Wild Side. I'm your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Beck with Paper Tiger. And just before the break, I was introducing the kind of natural history section of the show, where I want to think about what we know about the behavior and the habitat of tigers, and how this information can be used to try to help these guys out. So first I want to think about the habitat preferences of tigers. What's really amazing about these things is that they tend to be comfortable across a really wide range of habitat types, and basically they just need a few small things to be met wherever they are. So they want cover in which to hide, and dense vegetation is particularly good because they have this camouflage patterning that I mentioned early on in the show, and the more vegetation they have, the better that camouflage kind of helps them fit in. They also want to have proximity to water, and this is not unusual amongst animals. Tigers are actually quite good swimmers, and they are quite happy to cross large distances at a single go. They might cross lots of different times over the course of the day. So tigers that live next to rivers, for example, might ford back and forth a few different times. They do often go swimming in order to cool down. And of course, these things are living in very hot habitats, and so it can get, to 120 degrees. I guess I should translate that into Celsius. It's well above 40 degrees, and it's going to be extremely hot and uncomfortable. And so they will often plop into the water in order to cool down. They're actually quite clever and can float their prey in water, so they do know that if they put their prey into the water, it will make it quite a bit lighter and easier for them to manipulate, so they might push it in and then kind of drag it along in the water rather than dragging it across land where they have to deal with more gravity. They also will capture prey in water, so they are capable of wading into a stream and kind of maneuvering well enough to capture something that's maybe swimming or drinking or doing whatever. So they are quite comfortable in wet places, which, as you know, is something that we don't often see in a lot of cats. If you've got a house cat of your own, you've probably watched it watching water, but not too happy about getting itself wet. And this is a characteristic that is fairly unique. The only other animal that's kind of a big cat that's interested in water in the same way as tigers is the jaguar. So it's those two against all the other cats which prefer to, kind of tiptoe around and not get too wet. Another thing that tigers are really going to want in their habitat is a nice abundance of prey, which I mentioned earlier, and also good den locations. So they tend to use things like caves and hollow trees and really dense vegetation where they can raise their cubs, where the cubs can hide out and be safe and not be seen by predators. Now, although these things can be found in grasslands and in kind of savanna type areas like lions, and that's often what we kind of think of them as hiding out in. We see a lot of images of these guys prowling through those sorts of habitats. They often can be found in really rocky areas and also in forests. So the taiga, so boreal forest with coniferous trees, rainforest, evergreen forest, mangrove forest, deciduous forest, even thorn forest. So these guys really are foresty types of species, which is quite interesting to me because I do always picture them in other types of habitats. But whether you're talking about the ones that are in Siberia or the ones that are in northern India or Nepal, they do tend to be found very often in forests. Now, the way that they use space is also quite an interesting feature and something that does have a big influence on kind of the conservation side of things. So adult tigers of both sexes tend to be very highly territorial, and this can get quite vicious when they encounter each other in what one of them thinks is its own territory. And in order to kind of avoid these sorts of one-on-one aggressive encounters as much as possible, they will scratch into the ground and on trees in order to show that there is a resident there. They will spray the area with their scents, and they can also use vocalizations. So occasionally they'll just kind of rumble around and roar, and they can hear each other. So with all of those things going on, it is not too hard for neighboring tigers in other territories, or for itinerant tigers that might just be wandering through, to kind of keep track of who's there and what they've been up to, what part of the habitat they're in, and that allows them to avoid contact that can frequently lead to really big fights. Now, sometimes they have dominance displays where one of them will roll over and say, I give in, you're bigger, this is your place, and then it's all right. And this is particularly common when you've got one that's incredibly dominant and maybe one that's a bit small and young and very obviously an inferior. And when there is sufficient prey, these local guys are more likely to be a bit more forgiving and say, all right, you can stay here if you want, because they know they don't have to compete quite as much. But when these things are more evenly sized and when there is less prey around, so there is going to be kind of scramble to get the food that is available, things can get vicious very quickly, and often one or the other will end up dead. So, as I kind of suggested, when there is a lot of food around, things can be relaxed a bit, and researchers used to think that tigers were basically completely solitary. But what they found when they did lots of observations out in the field is that actually you frequently will find these things showing tolerance of each other when there is food around. So you might have a male that kind of wanders through and checks in on the females whose territories border his. You might find a large family, so maybe there you've got a couple of sisters that live side by side, or they live near their mother. Maybe you'll have a bunch of itinerants. As long as there's food around and they don't feel like they have to compete with each other, they do put up with the presence of another tiger. And so frequently you might find them gathering at the same kill in order to feed on this thing and take advantage of it while it's there. And some researchers have even seen 7 or 8 tigers gathering in a single place, completely happy to be in the same area as one another. So it isn't always true that these guys are going to be at each other's throats. And one of the other interesting things about these observations is that people have found that when they do share a kill, they're quite frequently friendly with each other, very orderly. So if you've ever seen images of lions feeding, you know that they can growl at each other, they can be quite vicious and chase each other off, and the male will not let the females or the young ones in until he's done. But actually that is not seen at all in tigers. So you see them be quite calm, they might kind of queue up, the males don't think that they need to be first, they might let females and young feed first. So it's a very different sort of thing, even though there are some other similarities between tigers and lions. Another thing that can help facilitate higher densities is not just an abundance of food, but also really dense vegetation. So when tigers can kind of hide from each other, they're able to occupy the same space without as much fighting. Because basically, as soon as someone comes along that you think is your superior, you can kind of shrink into the grass. You just have to pretend that you're not there, and then you can kind of, run off into the distance whenever that tiger has passed. So the habitat type will also influence how dense the area might be. Now, of course, territory size is also going to be dependent on resources. So a male typically will have quite a big territory, but they also only need to feed themselves. And so one of the surprising things that people have found recently is that females can also have very large territories when they've got their young. So these things might kind of expand and contract depending on particular circumstances at a given time. But when females have a few young to feed, they might need up to 27 square miles in order to cover enough ground to find all of the prey, to feed themselves and also their young. And in areas that have less food, or whenever you have maybe a drought or some kind of a bad condition that makes food less available, you will often find these guys roaming quite widely in order to find all the resources. Now, interestingly, males tend to overlap a bit with female ranges, and as you might expect, this is something that can facilitate mating, so that's probably why this happens. There does tend to be a bit more, lax about having encounters between males and females than between members of the same sex, so they are less aggressive when you are of the opposite sex. And that is, of course, because you do have to have mating events every now and then, and so you can't chase off individuals all the time. So what you often find is that you've got males kind of wandering into female ranges every now and then, potentially having a mate, and then go back to their own territory. And females tend to settle nearish their mothers after they leave, so kind of in a neighboring territory that might become kind of a bit more remote as the females grow up and become more independent. But males won't do that. Males tend to go farther away, and that's because they need to prevent inbreeding. And females, of course, they aren't going to breed with each other. If they've got one itinerant male, that male can breed with all of them, and that's no problem. But it's a bit more dangerous if you've got a male that settles near his mother and his sisters, because then he's just going to be sharing the same genes. So they do tend to be a bit more adventurous. And what they do is they'll strike out and they'll look for empty territories, and that, of course, is the best because it's empty, and then you wander into it and it's full, and that's that. But there are also times when they might go out and find an existing territory that they kind of like, or maybe they just can't go anywhere else because there's some geographical barrier. And then they basically have to squat there until they're able to challenge the resident male and make that their own territory. And that, of course, can be quite a big battle, so they have to wait until they are big and strong and in the right condition to have a success if they do that. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was St. Vincent with Year of the Tiger. And in this last portion of the show, I want to think a little bit more about the natural history of tigers. And the next topic on my list is their hunting and their diet. So I mentioned earlier that tigers will eat things like deer and pigs, and basically what they're after is kind of medium to large-sized ungulates. And these things can range from tapir and boar, all the way up to deer and buffalo, and even things as big as rhinos, which researchers have seen tigers taking down on their own, which is really impressive considering that rhinos are huge, they have incredibly thick skin, and they are not an animal that you want to tangle with. Tigers are also opportunistic, and they might eat smaller prey if it happens to be available to them, but of course it's most efficient if they go out and get this big stuff that will last longer. Now, one thing I do just want to mention is that man-eating is not something that you typically see in tigers, actually. I know that tigers do attack humans every now and then, but they're not generally doing that because they want to have a meal. And the only case that we really know that this happens a whole lot is in India. There's a section of India where you've got, for some reason, these tigers that are quite commonly interested in eating humans. And that seems to be because it's maybe a cultural thing that the tigers have learned and then passed down to their offspring. But in general, the only time that they'll do this is if they're unable to capture their natural prey. So once they're old or they're injured, humans are, unfortunately, a pretty easy thing to go after, and so that is why that would happen. But not generally under natural circumstances. Now, interestingly, they do also sometimes eat fiber, so they might go gnaw on some plants in order to kind of balance their diet, and I know that's not the kind of thing you might typically expect of a tiger. When they do go out hunting, we tend to think of cats as kind of being nocturnal, but actually tigers can be either nocturnal or diurnal, and most of the time when we do see them hunting at night, it's in areas where there are humans. So they seem to actually maybe prefer being out during the day, but when they have to, they'll hunt at night in order to escape human activity and human attention. And the way that they hunt is to hunt by ambush, and this tends to mean that they have a very low success rate. So they have to kind of just crouch in the grass and wait until something comes close enough that they can jump up and go after it. And obviously this is not going to work a whole lot of time because animals are quite wary, they're looking around, they're hearing, they're sniffing, they're doing everything they can to detect this sort of thing. And their prey items tend to be quite quick, they can be quite aggressive and very good at defending themselves. And so actually tigers only have a success rate of something like 1 in 20 to 1 in 10. So they do have to either do quite a lot per day or do quite a lot over the course of that week and a half kind of distance that they have in between different feeds in order to eventually get to the next thing that they're going to eat. What they typically do is pounce on their prey, and they use the fact that they are quite large and quite strong to knock the animals off balance and then grab onto their throats to suffocate them. And that's not unlike what lions do, except lions don't do that first bit where they're just imbalancing them. One of the things that I read that was really fascinating was that these guys who were out doing this book that I read, the photographer and all of his crew, they watched a tiger take down, I think it was like a buffalo or a cow or something like that. So I forget whether it was domestic or wild, but it was a really large ungulate. And they watched it take it down and kill it. And then the tiger, for whatever reason, kind of took off. I think maybe it had hidden it in the bush and it was going to go back and eat it later. So after all this was through, they went over to kind of weigh up this prey item because it did look quite large to them. And when they went to do this, they discovered that all 12 or 13 of them that were there were completely unable to budge the animal. That's how heavy it was. But this tiger had gone and knocked it over and held it down and actually dragged it along the ground for maybe 10 or 12 meters and before leaving it there. And it was able to do all of this completely on its own. So I think that right there gives you an idea of just how incredibly strong and athletic these animals are. And in fact, they are known to take down animals that weigh over a ton, and they themselves only weigh maybe 1/6 of that size. And they are the only living predator that we know of that tackles prey regularly that are that large. So this is a really impressive animal that we're talking about. Now they can also run quickly over short distances. A lot of cats do tend to have this ability, so they can be quite fast, but it is a very short distance, and so it's not very good for actually chasing prey. It will allow them to kind of, make a pounce and get that one little grab in before leaving, but not really running them down the way that lions might, or the way especially that cheetahs might. And as I've mentioned, they can go anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks without eating, and they compensate for this by, when they do eat really large amounts of flesh, so something like 34 kilograms at a time. And they can really pack on a lot of weight, lose it in between feeds, and then pack it on again. Now, feeding is all very well and good, but one of the really interesting things, especially if you are wanting to know about conservation is reproduction. Now, mating can occur year-round, but it tends to be concentrated between November and April. And during that time, females are going to be receptive, whenever they are receptive, for something less than a week. So when they are in the mood, they tend to have really frequent copulation attempts within that little window. And what will happen is that females will advertise the fact that they're ready by roaring, and this will attract the male. He'll hear her from quite a distance and come on in. And when they encounter each other, they'll play fight, then they'll mate, then they'll have another kind of bout of roaring, and then they'll play fight, and then they'll mate, and it just keeps on going. And basically, some researchers have found that they'll mate maybe every couple of minutes, certainly every 5 to 10 minutes at the most, for a couple of days solid. So this is a really intensive period that they go through of mating. And the female will then gestate for only 3 or 4 months after she becomes pregnant. And she generally produces something like 1 to 6 cubs, but 3 is the average. And cubs are reared by the female alone. And in fact, some people have seen males come along and kill off cubs, as you see in lions as well. And so females often will be quite wary if males do show up, unless, of course, it is the sire of those young. The offspring, once they're born, are nursed for 3 to 6 months, but then they'll stay with the female for quite a long time after that. So probably until they're about 2 to 2.5 years old. So this means that there can be considerable time in between different pregnancies of the female. And the young are capable of hunting from about 11 months onwards, and they become better and better at it as they go. And this allows them to finally reach that kind of independence once they get to 2.5 years old, after learning from their mother and practicing, but having her there to kind of supplement their feeds as they go along. And all of this can start for females at about 3 to 4 years old, and males take a bit more time, so maybe 4 to 5 years old is when they're able to start reproducing. So what does all of this stuff that I've told you mean for the future of tigers? Well, unlike lots of other endangered species, tigers can breed quite easily, as I mentioned earlier with the case of the Siberian tiger, and also quite productively, and this is true both in captivity and in the wild. So there's a lot of hope that these guys can kind of repopulate themselves, as they have in the past after massive environmental disasters. And I mentioned that Siberian tigers had something like only 20 to 30 animals. Well, even before that, a really long time ago, there was a volcano that went off in kind of the Malaysia, Indonesia sort of region, I forget which. And actually, people think that this almost completely eliminated tigers, along with several other species that were unfortunate enough to be in the area. But they bounced back from that, the entire species, from only about 100 or so individuals, and now we have all these thousands of individuals in many different subspecies. So this is certainly something that they are capable of doing. And the two things that we can really do to help that happen are to target poaching, so enforcing harsher penalties and reducing the desire for this, or both of these things, hopefully, and also protecting habitat in order to keep humans out of protected areas that have already been set aside, and also create new protected areas, and most importantly, create corridors that protect all the different spots where tigers live, so that they can flow from one to the other and disperse without going through human habitats. And this improved dispersal is also going to help increase gene flow, which is quite good for the population. Now, the kind of catch to this is that these two goals are only going to be possible if people have access to resources and don't suffer from human-wildlife conflict. And of course, in these areas that are developing areas, they're areas where tigers do occasionally attack humans, those are quite difficult things to ensure. So what we have to do is try to encourage systems where you've got the local communities benefiting from protecting the tigers and continuing the health of the tiger population. And that's been quite successful in places like the Masai Mara, where you've got the indigenous peoples changing their attitudes about lions and living with the lions and really benefiting from them. So hopefully we can do this for tigers as well. And there are a lot of good programs in place that are already helping to make this happen and kind of start this process off. And there have been some really great successes, but there have also been some failures. And basically these guys they have everything in place, and they're just chronically short on funding. Everything's always short on funding in the conservation world. So these people do really hope to have private donations and ecotourists and government funding and all sorts of stuff. And I'm not saying this in order to sell anything. Although the book that I did review is a book that was produced in order to try to help make money for tiger conservation. But certainly if you're someone who's interested in traveling out there and seeing these habitats in the wild, being an ecotourist is definitely something that has the potential to help a lot of these things out, or to kind of donate your time and go volunteer. So definitely keep that in mind, and definitely think about locating the book, tracking it down. Look up tigers online to see if you are interested in maybe donating to some conservation efforts, and I'll provide information for all of this stuff, as always, on the Wildside website. That's all for me, and I'll talk to you next week.